Just waiting for the slide presentation. Let me just start off when discussing U.S. policy. There is always a caveat that one has to have in mind with regard to U.S. policy, especially in this part of the world where we've been so active in recent decades, which is there's always been a degree of inconsistency and incoherence in our policies. And I'll give you a few examples here to start off. First, in 1990, if you remember when there was a crisis between Kuwait and Iraq, our ambassador to Iraq told Saddam Hussein that we do not have a policy on these kind of inter-Arab problems. And as a result, Iraq invaded Kuwait. And what did we do? We organized an international coalition to get Iraq out of Kuwait. When President or candidate George W. Bush ran for office, he said that he doesn't do nation building. What happens after he becomes president, you have 9/11, you have the American invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, and you have the two biggest nation building efforts since World War II. And then President Obama ran for office saying he wanted to avoid a third Middle Eastern war and get us out of the two wars we already were in Iraq and Afghanistan. And what happens after the fall of Mosul in June 2014? Well, he commits our air and ground forces to a protracted campaign which is still going on today against ISIS. Now, President Trump is seen as even more volatile as his predecessors. And I would say that U.S. policy under President Trump has been driven by even more contradictions than are usual in U.S. policy. So, for instance, it's well known that President Trump wanted American troops out of Afghanistan, but he was convinced by his advisors to keep them there. He said he wanted U.S. troops out of Syria, but it's clear that at least for now, we're keeping the 2,000 or so Special Forces operators there. If you look at the primary U.S. government documents about strategy, the National Security Strategy and the National Defense Strategy, which were issued earlier this year, the emphasis is on China, Russia, North Korea in that order, and then comes Iran and ISIS. But if you listen to the White House this year, or you look at the Twitter feeds of National Security Advisor John Bolton or Secretary of State Pompeo, it's all Iran all the time. And at a time that the United States has pursued a policy of maximum pressure on Iran, which has the potential to raise tensions and perhaps even lead to conflict with Iran, we have announced that we're withdrawing missile defense systems from the region and sending them to Asia. So my comments about U.S. policy in the Eastern Mediterranean should all be taken with that in mind. This is kind of a snapshot of a work in progress, and things might be shifting now. And in fact, there was recently the news reports about the U.S. Trying to organize a naval exercise between the Greeks and the Cypriots and the Israelis. So there might be some change in store for U.S. policy towards the Eastern Mediterranean. But let me just give you my take about where we have been, at least until now, in our policy there. First of all, if you look at the aforementioned strategy documents I mentioned before, you don't find the word Mediterranean mentioned even once. Lots of mention of Pacific, some of Atlantic, Mediterranean, not even a word. And I guess I should put a presidential SAD there next to it. Now, I would also say that for the most part, from the point of view of American policy, the Eastern Mediterranean does not have intrinsic importance, by and large, to the U.S. Its importance is largely derivative of a variety of issues that are important to either our allies or other policy areas. I've highlighted in red the areas where I think the Mediterranean is of intrinsic importance to the U.S. For instance, development of gas in the Eastern Mediterranean in order to reduce EU reliance on gas from Russia and elsewhere. The Mediterranean has a sea line of communication. That's the SLOC there. I think about 20% of world oil shipments go through the Suez Canal every day. And I think almost 10% of world shipping goes through there. So the Mediterranean is a major maritime crossroads. Ballistic missile defense. We have two ships in the Eastern Mediterranean that are homeported in Rota, Spain. that are devoted to the defense of, one to the defense of Israel and one to the defense of NATO. These are Aegis-class destroyers that played a role in our kind of global missile defense architecture. And then with regard to Russia, Iran, instability, migration, these are other factors in which the Mediterranean plays a role. But again, the Mediterranean is not of intrinsic importance. It's only importance because it's a venue in which these other things occur. And then we have now, as I mentioned before, with regard to reports of perhaps a naval exercise involving the US and Greece, Cyprus, and Israel, you have perhaps the development of that triangle or that square for leverage vis-a-vis Turkey or to reduce Russian influence, whether it be in Cyprus or the Levant. I also think that there's a number of countervailing factors which might, which have, at least until now, reduced the importance of the Mediterranean in US policy. First of all, the fact that the president wants to get out of the Middle East reduces the Eastern Mediterranean, which is, of course, adjacent to the Levant in US calculations. The contentious relationship that the US has had with some of our traditional US allies have perhaps also contributed to the downgrading of the Eastern Mediterranean. And also this administration's preference for subcontracting security to local allies also means that we have a reduced presence in that part of the world, which I'll discuss a little more in a moment. But we've also learned, despite the fact that the president wants to leave this part of the world, that if you don't visit the Middle East, it will visit you. And I would just simply cite our experience in leaving Iraq in 2011 and then having to return in 2014 with the comeback of ISIS. And likewise, the refugee crisis that came out of the civil war in Syria, which had political consequences in Europe, geopolitical consequences that I think many Americans consider to be adverse to American interests. We also have an increasingly complex operational environment with the emergence of these anti-access, area denial capabilities. And I'll just have a graphic here which shows, now this is, Syria is in the bottom right here, but this basically shows the efforts by the Russians to create these series of A2AD bubbles consisting of surface-to-air missiles, surface-to-surface missiles, land attack cruise missiles in order to keep enemies away, but also create freedom of action for their forces and their diplomacy in those parts of the world. I'll just focus in here on Syria. And here's just a little bit more detail of the Syrian bubble. Some of this information might be a little bit old, but again, you can see you have here both the Russian S-300 and S-400 missiles in Syria. You have anti-ship cruise missiles, shore-based anti-ship cruise missiles. They also have surface-to-surface missiles there. And then, as Mickey mentioned, you have kind of a naval-based offshore element consisting usually of a missile cruiser, a couple of frigates, and then small corvettes, all of them with, or almost all of them with caliber cruise missiles. Also, I mentioned the increasingly complex maritime environment here. This is a very complex graphic. I'll just focus on the main thing here. Look at the Horn of Africa. You've got almost every actor that's active in the maritime arena is establishing a shorehold here to enable and facilitate maritime operations around the Horn. You also have a growing presence in the Red Sea of just about all the actors that are active in the region. And when I'm saying that actors active in the region, it's not just the United States, the UK, and France. You have the Russians there now. You have the Turks, the Chinese. UAE is very active, especially around the Horn of Africa. Turkey establishing at the Suakin a port. I have Iran here. That should be, that's old information, but as of 2014, Iran no longer has access to Port Sudan. But anyhow, this is the neighborhood next door to the Eastern Mediterranean. And what often happens down the street often comes to a theater near you very shortly. And we also know, we already know that the Russians, beside having the port of Tartus, have been looking to gain access to naval ports in Egypt and Libya. So it's no longer an arena in which the United States and its allies are kind of the sole actors that have a naval presence as well as access to naval facilities around the region. one other thing that has been brought up earlier today, this is the earlier slide, but I just want to focus on, there was hope in the past that NATO would be able to extend its security structures to the region. So you had this kind of Mediterranean dialogue, and it was not very, I don't think it was overly ambitious at the time, but I think the long-term hope was eventually European security structures could extend to the Middle East and help stabilize the Middle East. But instead what's happened is that the Middle East has exported its people and instability to the West. And I would mention here the migrant crisis. This is a map showing the flow of populations in the 2015 period. As a result of the joint plan of action between the EU and Turkey, the flow from here has been greatly reduced. And as a result, a lot of the pressure has then moved to North Africa. Some of the European EU countries, such as Italy, have struck deals with the Libyan Coast Guard and Libyan militias in order to reduce the flow of refugees. But this is still a big problem. And the worst may yet to come, because as John mentioned earlier before in his talk, the Syrian civil war is not quite over. We're seeing the wars after the war now. So is there the potential with operations in Italy in the future of more refugees flowing across the border, although it's also possible that the regime and its allies might do that operation in a way so that it reduces refugee flows. And that's something that's possible. But as a result of environmental degradation and the like, it's quite possible we'll see an increase in refugee flows in the future. So this is not necessarily over. Plus, we don't know if the violence that started as a result, and the unrest and instability that started as a result of the Arab Spring in 2011 is over, or whether we're actually going to see a second wave in the future, perhaps in Jordan, perhaps in the Gulf, perhaps in Iran as a result of American sanctions and the like, and environmental degradation there. So it's not clear that the worst is over in this area. Oh. Okay, there. Let me just say, I think I committed an own goal there. Okay. Now, the next point I want to make, even despite all the talk about the U.S. leaving the Middle East, I think the point I want to make is that the United States still retains significant military presence in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. This is part of a legacy of past investments. We've invested billions of dollars in infrastructure in this region, and it's not going away. And I'll tell you a little bit in a moment, actually, we're continuing to invest in this part of the world, and so do our allies. So are our allies, so that, for instance, we've built up infrastructure in northeastern Syria to accommodate the 2,000 soldiers that are there now. So we have also 2 airfields in northeastern Syria. We are now upgrading the air base in Jordan, Mawafaq Salti, to the tune of $143 million, and that's the biggest investment around the world at this time in upgrading airbase facilities anywhere. And we already have a major logistics hub in Kuwait City, in Kuwait International Airport, and we're further expanding that in order to enable us to further operate. That's mainly for the Gulf, but this is, again, the Eastern Mediterranean is not that far from the Gulf, and to the degree that most of our forces in the region are in the Gulf, that will help our ability to reposition forces in the Eastern Mediterranean in the event of a crisis. The Qataris are upgrading El Udeid Air Base. They're spending $1.8 billion on this project, and this will benefit our operations there. And finally, the U.S. is negotiating naval access to the new port and logistics hub at Duqm in Oman, outside of the Persian Gulf. So getting back to the issue of U.S. policy, there's really a schizophrenic characteristic to it. On the one hand, the president says, I want to bring our troops home from the region. I want to rebuild America. But what we're seeing on the ground consistently is further entrenchment within the context of reshifting the emphasis of American deployments around the world to Asia and the Gulf rather than the Eastern Mediterranean. Let me just show you. I have some more graphics here, which this mainly just shows. I know this is very hard to see, and if you could read it, you don't need glasses. This basically shows the weight of American deployments around the world. You have a global map here, These figures are about 2 or 3 years old. I have more accurate figures in the next graphic, so don't try to read these. But the bottom line is most of our forces overseas are in Asia, Europe, and the Persian Gulf arena, okay, not Eastern Mediterranean. Sub-Saharan Africa, we have a small number, in South America, a small number. Here are our current, this is my best count of US deployed forces around the world at present. These numbers don't, this is from US DoD sources. I think we should actually not publish these sources and try to get Chinese and Russian spies to pay for them and use the money for investment in our DoD infrastructure. But we publish these figures. So you have here in Bahrain, we have nearly 5,000 people at NAVCENT headquarters. This is Iraq, we're around 5,000. This is Kuwait, where we have both an air base and our forward Army Central Headquarters, 2,000. Qatar, you have about 10,000 between the CENTCOM headquarters there and El Udeid Air Base. And also the Combined Air Operations Center, which commands American air operations in the Central Command region, and then Syria 2,000. And these are just kind of to compare to our force levels in Japan. You got about 60,000, South Korea 30,000. So 27,000 in the Gulf. That's not the Eastern Mediterranean, I realize, but a lot of this could be shifted. If you add a carrier strike group, if it sails into the Persian Gulf, add another 6,000 to that at any time. Here's the force footprint in the region. Again, the only difference between this map and, say, a map of about a decade and a half ago would be Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia. We've got just about everything in this part of the world that we had previously. Ceuta Bay in Crete, Naples, Sixth Fleet headquarters in Italy. You got Moron Air Base in Spain and Rota Naval Base in Spain. So we still have the infrastructure that we need. It's not lacking. What we lack is actually forces. And I'll go a little bit into that in a moment. This is naval deployments by fleet for the last 18 months based on published information. You notice the 7th Fleet, which is in the Pacific. Right now, it's around, and you see it varies depending on whether there's exercises or crises or the like, about 50 ships in the Pacific, okay? 6th Fleet, and the 6th Fleet is not just the Mediterranean. Keep in mind, during the Cold War, it was largely the Mediterranean. The 6th Fleet, and I'll show you a map in a moment, 6th Fleet covers all of Europe up to the Baltics and down towards Africa and around the Cape of Good Hope to include the Southwest Indian Ocean. So the 6th Fleet, even though they're kind of the numbers for the 6th and 5th Fleet, the 5th Fleet is in the Persian Gulf, and the 6th Fleet covers the Mediterranean among other areas, even though they kind of, more or less the same in the high teens or low 20s. The 6th Fleet covers a lot more area, which means the Mediterranean doesn't really get a lot of coverage by the US Navy anymore. And I had a graphic, which I cut because I just don't have time for it, which basically shows US naval deployments over the last 2 years. And we steamed through our carrier strike groups and amphibious readiness groups steam through the Mediterranean a lot, but they don't stay there very often, except for the strike in Syria where they arrived after the strike, if I'm correct. Basically, we don't have a large naval presence in the Mediterranean. And this is just to show you, the 6th Fleet covers all of this area. 5th Fleet is here. So the Mediterranean has to compete with deployments to, again, the Baltics, the North Sea, the Southeast Atlantic, and Southwest Indian Ocean. So again, the Mediterranean doesn't get a lot of love, when it comes to American naval deployments. Okay. The main problem that we face right now, as I mentioned before, is that Russia, China, and North Korea are increasingly absorbing the resources, military resources, and the attention of U.S. policymakers. And the problem is we cannot focus on the Middle East or the Eastern Mediterranean the way we have in the past, simply because, as I mentioned before, Defense Department rates China, Russia, and North Korea as higher in its list of priorities than it does the Middle East or the Eastern Mediterranean. Okay. And so what are the implications of all of this? First of all, there was an excellent article written in Foreign Policy a couple of years ago by Admiral James Stavridis, who's he's a retired 4-star admiral, and he was also head of EUCOM for a while. He said we need a Eastern Mediterranean strategy. And so I'm going to start off, I agree with that wholeheartedly, simply because the complexity of the problems that we face in this part of the world are such, and especially the proximity of military forces from Russia, Iran, the United States, Israel, are such that we can't afford to kind of deal with the problems of this region on an ad hoc basis anymore. We have to have an actual strategy which allocates resources and prioritizes and phases actions. Also, as I mentioned before, Assad's victory is likely to generate more jihadist terrorism and perhaps regime adventurism, which will contribute to instability. There's the potential for conflict over the development of offshore gas fields. And then, the whole problem with the U.S. and Turkey and this Greece, Cyprus, Israel triangle and Turkish pushback against the Cypriot and Israeli claims in this part of the world, and Hezbollah pushback against Israeli claims with regard to gas. Okay. There's also the possibility that Iran will decide to push back against America's policy of maximum pressure in the Eastern Mediterranean. One thing that we have to think about is that to the degree that Iran is trying to ensure the survivability of its missile force and its operational effectiveness, they might try to develop capabilities in conjunction with Hezbollah to strike at the naval ships that we have in the Eastern Mediterranean that are part of our global missile defense umbrella. That's another consideration there. I think the Eastern Mediterranean is already an arena of great power competition between the US and Russia. And then, as I mentioned before, there's the potential for new waves of terrorism and migration which could affect Mediterranean security. And again, even though it may not affect the United States directly, it affects our European allies, and that affects American interests. So the bottom line is, I'll simply ask, I don't know whether the United States is pivoting to a greater role in the Eastern Mediterranean with these announcements of a naval exercise that we're trying to organize. But I raise the question, can the region manage the security challenges of the Eastern Mediterranean on their own? But they might have to. Or will the U.S. resume a regional leadership role there? And I will answer by saying I don't know, but it's something which I hope we could perhaps discuss during the Q&A. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mike. Alexander Pevsner on China.